Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of Radical Candor and Just Work.
I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. And on our last episode, we talked about micromanagement. Today, we're going to talk about the other side of that coin, absentee management. And we're going to explore the differences between absentee management and quiet firing. Because while these two things can feel the same to the person who's experiencing them, the thing that makes them different is the intention behind the behavior. According to Gallup, quiet firing happens when managers allow employees to have truly toxic or miserable experiences at work as a way to squeeze them out. It's a form of gaslighting. Or, as we might say at Radical Candor, a form of manipulative insincerity. That's a pretty strong form of manipulative insincerity. Kim, do you feel like that's manipulative insincerity at its outreach?
Well, I mean, I think manipulative insincerity can get even worse. But certainly if a manager is, for example, not dealing with the fact that somebody is getting bullied at work because they're hoping that the person will leave, that's pretty manipulatively insincere. It's a boss who wants to be a bully is outsourcing their bullying to some other employee. Like, that's pretty toxic.
Ugh, that's terrible.
But I've seen it happen.
I feel like, Kim, you've seen it all. If you haven't seen it all, we do have another office space example for you. Jason is our resident office space expert. Can you explain for our listeners, Milton, poor Milton, how was Milton quietly fired?
So Milton was basically asked to move his desk over and over and over again to less and less desirable locations until in the movie, his desk is actually in the basement in like a boiler room. And as this is happening, every time he's asked to do this, he starts to quietly say under his breath, "Okay, but I'm going to burn this building to the ground if you take away my stapler." And so the last indignity of Milton in the movie is they take his stapler away. So even he puts up with all of these desk moves, but then when they take away his stapler, he cannot take it anymore.
The staple that broke the stapler's back.
Yeah, I mean, he's an incredibly sympathetic character. And at the same time, as this movie does so well, it's hard to totally feel bad for him because it's also fairly clear that he's incompetent. So like the combination of those two things, which is like, this is clearly not how to treat another human being. And at the same time, there's like this tinge of sympathy that you have for his coworkers because he's very difficult to work with and not very good at his job.
Kim, I think you and I need to make a commitment to watching Office Space. How do you feel?
I was just thinking, I'm going to watch it. I'm going to do it tonight, maybe.
Oh, maybe. All right, we need to have some metrics on our watching of Office Space. Jason, is it safe to say that the treatment of this character, Milton, was intentional by his boss? He was intentionally mistreated?
Yes.
Okay.
It was very clear from a plot perspective that this was they had a goal of pushing someone past their breaking point so that they would finally quit. I didn't say they did actually try to fire Milton, but there was an accounting error that caused him to get a paycheck for a while. But even after they fixed that, he still kept showing up to work. He definitely wasn't getting the message. And so this was a sort of last resort way of quietly firing Milton, but it was incredibly humiliating and the kind of thing that even having this plan, I think, requires a level of depravity as a manager, like coming up with this plan.
No, it's truly evil. I mean, and I guess, as you're talking, Jason, I'm sort of thinking very often companies talk about managing people out, and you can consciously and respectfully manage people out, and you can manipulatively and sincerely manage them out. And I guess Milton was managed out in the most depraved, manipulatively insincere possible way.
And I think, so just to get back to this idea of absentee management and sort of intentions and the distinction between absentee management and quiet firing, Kim, let's talk about sort of that ghost boss who's rarely seen or heard from their direct reports, and almost from the perspective of the manager What do you think is happening for that manager, and how would you distinguish what does a manager need to look at for themselves? Of are they being an absentee manager, or are they actually more in this quiet firing realm?
Yeah. So let's draw a bright line between the two, and then we'll talk about the similarities, because I think probably quiet firing is a subset of absentee management. But in general, absentee management has nothing to do with the quality of the employees. It has to do with the mentality of the manager. So an absentee manager is a person who thinks, oh, if I just hire the right people and get out of their way, they'll do great work. So usually it's not aimed at someone who's doing bad work. There's an assumption that people will do good work. But of course, people take jobs because they want managers who they can learn from. So there's many, many flaws in the absentee manager's thinking. And often an absentee manager will even be most absentee vis-a-vis their best employees, the employees who are doing their best work, because they'll think, oh, they don't need me, or I don't want to micromanage, or I don't want to get in their way. But ignoring someone is a terrible way to build a good relationship with them. One of my favorite stories in Radical Candor comes from a conversation that I had with Dick Costolo when he was the CEO of Twitter. And we were talking about the tendency to just say, oh, my management philosophy is that I hire great people and then I get out of their way. And Dick said, that's like saying to have a good marriage, just marry the right person and then never spend another minute with them. That's not going to go very well. And then he kind of went on this riff, as Dick is very good at doing. He said, imagine if I went home tonight and told my wife, I don't want to micromanage you, so I'm not going to spend any time with you or the kids this year. It's like that would not go over very well.
Yeah. Jason, as you hear Kim share about that, just to kind of bring in this idea that there was research from Gallup where like a lot of managers push their team members away, not meaning to, but they're not helping them perform, develop, or feel appreciated. And they may even really care deeply about people, but they're often end up being more absent than present. They're more distracted either by organizational politics or even just focused on even building up their team. But in general, they are inconsistent with their expectations and their communication with their team members. So Jason, just for you to start, and I know you and I shared on this in our thought partner discussion last season, but what's both from you as having had some absentee management moments, but also your philosophy about why absentee management happens?
Yeah, I'll just say that this is a very common phenomenon. So if you hear us describing this, and obviously the Milton example is an extreme example, and you're feeling very guilty, I want to relieve some of that guilt, because there's a tendency in organizations to go where the problems are. And your problems are often your underperforming employees. And so one of the things that I found myself coaching managers on the most frequently over the course of my time being a manager of managers is you are not spending enough time with your high performers. You're spending all of your time trying to fix a performance issue with this one particular employee. And everybody else on your team, their development is slowing down, become imbalanced. The amount of time and effort that you're spending has become imbalanced. Obviously, now that's not the quiet firing is the inverse of that. So you take
what you're talking about is kind of squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Exactly.
It greases your time.
Exactly. And to me, like that is the most common starting place for absentee management is someone has a big problem that they're dealing with and all of a sudden like everybody else goes away. I do think there's the example that the sort of management style example that you and Dick Costello were talking about also exists. But from my experience, the most frequent source of absentee management was there was some other big problem, which was causing them to ignore everybody else on their team. And I think from a philosophical perspective, the thing I take very seriously is that as a leader, my job is to, from a people management perspective, is to ensure that each of my team members is growing in the way and at the rate that they want to grow. And if at any time I feel like that gets out of sync, and the way I find that out is like I check in frequently or like, is there more that you want to be doing? Is there something else I could be doing to better support your growth? That's my signal that I may be in the wrong mode of management, meaning I might be micromanaging or I might be absentee managing that person. But you can't do that unless you actually know the ambitions of the people on your team are, and unless you ask. Because I think it's very hard to self-diagnose micromanagement and absentee management. Like, I do think you need an external perspective, and the perspective of the team member you're managing is often the best source.
Yeah, it gets measured not at your mouth, but at their ear, like so many other good things. I think I want to share your compassion for the absentee managers out there, though, Jason, because it happens to people who really do have good intentions and who are overall good managers. In fact, one of the more painful moments in my career came when I had this tendency, when people would come to me with a problem, I had this tendency to say, what do you think? Or come to me with 3 solutions and 1 recommendation. I wouldn't engage in the conversation. And finally, somebody came to me and said, Kim, when do I get to just talk to you? It was like a stab to my heart. I realized that I was sort of pushing people away and not being willing to be a thought partner to folks. And that was an important lesson for me.
That's really interesting when you think about the phrase absentee. Sort of, we've had the term ghosting and sort of the person not being there. But what's interesting too is actually the person could be there, but really not be present or saying things that are not landing in a way of being validating. And one thing that's coming to mind for me is just, we will often do a listening exercise and people are so dialed in to know in a couple of minutes if someone is really present with them. So the person might actually have the one-on-one meeting, but you can tell on the other side if they're there, but they're not there. And so another way of being absent is actually, Kim, what you're saying is that the time is not meaningful for the other person because it's all about performance and what have you done for me lately rather than just showing up. So those are some of the things we've talked about being a thought partner. One of the examples of a go-to question, a question to solicit feedback that I will often mention in our workshops, that if folks haven't heard me say this, I hope it's helpful, is for folks that tend to be challenged by their own absentee management is, what's a time last week where you wish I had been involved, or where might you need something from me next week? And this was inspired by you, an example of when you had given someone a big project, you thought it was a sign of real confidence and this person was overwhelmed. But anything more you want to say about what's underneath that kind of question and why that's helpful for folks that are struggling with absentee management?
I think I may have told this story on the podcast before, but I'll just say that the source of that question is one of a very embarrassing moment for me in my history as a manager so I had that problem where I gave this employee a big project. That actually led to tears. The person stayed up for 3 days and they couldn't figure something out. And they were like, why have you forsaken me? And I was like, I didn't forsake you. I trusted you. I gave you this big project and I left you alone, which is exactly what I would have wanted my manager to do for me. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I have this big learning. And so now I'm not going to be an absentee manager. And so, of course, I went around and I told everybody that I was an absentee manager and I felt so terrible about this. And so I was going to be more involved. And then my team was like, hey, hang on a second. Actually, you're not absentee managing me. You're micromanaging me. So I need you to get off my back. So it was like this incredible swing where I was like, I felt bad and I figured it out. Aha, I'm going to be much better now. And then my team is like, you figured out nothing. And so my question that I asked for a while is was effectively, where am I micromanaging and where am I absentee managing? And what do you need from me so that you feel like I'm being a thought partner? Now, I didn't have Kim's language, so it was a much longer question when I was asking it. But that's what I would have asked if I had the language that Kim offers in the book.
But I like your question, Jason. I mean, where am I involved where you'd like me to butt out, and where am I not involved where you'd like me to butt in? That's a good question, actually.
Yeah.
And I think
it led to a lot of great discussions. So it really did work.
Yeah. And it's such an important reminder of how different people want different things, And if you're optimizing for my needs, then you're not going to be meeting Amy's needs. And if you're optimizing for Amy's needs, you're not going to be meeting my needs.
Yep.
The other thing I'll say, and thank you, Jason, for sharing again on that story, is just that if this episode is touching a nerve. Most of our best stories do come from moments of tears. So just like those aha moments. So I feel compassion for you and for the people around you, and just knowing for myself a lot of those moments where it just seemed like it couldn't get any worse. But they sure turned helpful for people years later. So our loss is your gain. I do think it's important to mention that one of the unintended consequences of having an absentee manager or being one is that often they might have no idea what their direct reports are working on. And so they're not in a position to effectively report their team's success to their own bosses and sort of promote them in the organization. And so as a result, great employees can be passed over for promotions, for raises, recognition, and in turn can lead these workers to look for other opportunities. And there's a new phrase now, Brandy, you are our TikTok meme reporter, this idea of rage applying, which apparently is angrily firing off your resume to jobs with better pay, benefits, and perks. So, Brandy, did you have an experience with rage applying? Is it capital R, capital A? This is a real thing, rage applying.
I think it's an all cap situation. I don't know how they're talking about it on TikTok, but rage applying, I have done this. Back in the early aughts, out of college, I was a beat reporter for a daily newspaper, and it was everything you can imagine. If you've never worked at a newspaper, it was long hours at city council meetings, embarrassingly low wage, and a lot of coffee. But I loved it. I'd always wanted to be a writer. There were not fedoras. There were some more like Ben's winter hats at the city and town council meetings. While I loved the job, I didn't love the company. And one day I had a disagreement with the publisher that left me feeling kind of equally helpless and vengeful. I was basically put in a position where I couldn't really explain why I had done something without throwing somebody else under the bus. And I just went back to my desk and opened up an email, and the publisher of our competing newspaper in town and was like, "Hey, do you have any open positions?" And he knew who I was because we always kept track of each other. And I didn't even formally apply or even send a resume. We just met for lunch. And by the end of the week, I had a new job as an editor, and I had better pay, better money, and better benefits. So I never would have done that had I not been so mad by what was happening at my current organization, because I would have thought, I'm not qualified. I'm just out of college. Like, I didn't know what I was doing when I got into that new role, but I learned on the job, and it was all thanks to being very angry.
Yeah, anger's not always a bad thing, is it?
No, I know this just from talking to a lot of my friends who are looking for jobs. Don't apply for things because they don't think they're qualified. And I would have never had a job in my life if I had done that. You know, I think you can learn anything as long as you want to and you're willing, and don't let the job description or feel like I can't do that scare you away from going after what you want, especially if you have a bad boss.
Or if you're being absentee managed.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it sounds like rage applying is maybe not a new phenomenon, but we now have the names and the memes to talk about it. And maybe it's a little easier to fire your resume off. So there's some research from Gallup, and Brady, thank you for sharing that, because it goes into some of what we're talking about, which is that globally, only 1 in 3 employees strongly agree that someone has talked to them about their progress in the past 6 months. That's amazing. Only 1 in 3 people say that someone has talked to them about their progress in the past 6 months. And what's more, there's a pretty big disconnect between what employees experience and their managers' perceptions of their own behavior. So to quote, only 22% of employees strongly agree that their manager continually helps them clarify work priorities, whereas nearly twice as many managers, 43%, believe that they are actively helping employees set priorities. So I think, first of all, that goes to a lot of what we try to do at Radical Candor, which is understand different perceptions, check for understanding. But I'd love to hear, Kim, Jason, kind of one next step that if you're a well-intentioned leader, what you can do to start understanding, first of all, if I'm veering into absentee management, and then what you can do to get yourself out of it. Jason, your story was really instructive. So let me go over to Kim and see if you have anything else after Kim shares.
So I think that one of the things that often happens at work and really in any relationship where we're communicating is that we imagine that communication has happened, but it has not happened. And part of the reason why we imagine it has happened is because it is either we're busy or the conversation is a little awkward. And so we pretend that we have communicated when we haven't. So, for example, I was coaching one leader who got employee engagement scores back. And it was sort of like this Gallup poll. Like none of this guy's employees thought they had talked to him about their careers. And he was genuinely, and I think understandably, frustrated. He was like, all I do is have career conversations every day, all day. Like, I don't know what's happening. And then I started asking questions like, have you talked to people? Have you labeled the conversation a career conversation? Have you talked explicitly? Very often it's useful to have this process in which you are talking to people. I mean, I joke that one of the most common feedback mistakes that happens, and this is kind of a version of accidental absentee management, is someone will be working for me and they'll be worried about something someone on their team has done. And I will say, well, did you talk to the person directly? Oh, yeah, I had the conversation. I'm worried I really upset them. I'm worried I said it too harshly. And then I'll bump into the person who did the thing and I'll say, how's such and such going? And they'll look at me like, what are you talking about? And it's not that their boss, my employee, has lied about the conversation. They thought they had the conversation, but they did not have the conversation. And this happens even, I mean, the most extreme example of this, there was someone who I coached who said that they were firing someone. And they really were cared about this person they were firing, and they thought long and hard about how to tell the person. And they thought it was a very good conversation that landed really well. And then 2 hours later, this person stuck their head in his office and said, did you fire me back then? And he was like, now I had to do it all over again. And that is not kind. And so very often, I think part of what happens with absentee management is you think you've had the conversation. You think you've talked to the person about where they're headed in their career or something they're doing really well or something they could improve upon, but they have not heard you. And it is your job to be heard in this case. It is not the other person's fault. If you're the manager and the other person hasn't heard you, it's your fault, not their fault.
Yeah. My ruinous empathy story is rooted in absentee management. I wouldn't have phrased it that way before our discussion today, but that's effectively what it was, where I thought I was giving feedback to an employee. He thought we were having an interesting intellectual conversation. As a result, his work suffered for months. And other people on the team absolutely saw it as absentee management because they were like, why isn't Jason dealing? Like, this guy is turning in substandard work over and over and over again. Why isn't Jason dealing with it? And it wasn't until someone else on the team was kind enough to come in and threaten to quit, basically, that my ears perked up and I was like, oh, I see I have made a mistake. I've done something wrong. The essential feedback was you assumed that you had given this feedback, but the person didn't hear it. And then you were incurious about whether or not they really took it to heart. And the combination of those two things allowed a bad situation to continue for a much longer period of time than it had any right to.
It's so interesting you shared that story, Jason, because as Kim was talking, I also had that spark of thinking that absentee management in some ways is that lack of clarity or challenge. So in one respect, it might be ruinous empathy and that you're being kind, but you're not being clear, whether it's because you don't want to hurt their feelings or whatnot, but the challenge is not clear in your story. So your intention, we would say, is good, right? Like the absentee manager who has good intentions but isn't being clear. And then the quiet firing version is the more manipulative insincerity version of it, where your intention is not good and you're also not being clear. You're sort of doing something behind their back. So I don't know if that's too simplistic, but it seems to me there's something about absentee management that really is about the lack of challenge directly. And then it could be also a lack of care personally, or there could be care personally, but without the challenge directly. Is that oversimplification?
No, I think that's absolutely true.
That is a useful simplification.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So While we are talking about this subset of absentee management, quiet firing, there was a November 2022 HBR Harvard Business Review piece asking the question, are you being quiet fired? And this term referring to companies that are intentionally creating a hostile work environment, maybe moving your desk into more and more in the boiler room, but encouraging people to leave voluntarily. I don't think they had quotes in the article, but I'm going to put some air quotes involuntarily in order to avoid the financial, psychological, and legal costs associated with forcing people out. It's just hard to read. Like, it just seems such a terrible thing. But some signs to look for could include, there's sort of 4 buckets. So one is changes in work responsibilities, like maybe you're not getting new opportunities or there's unreasonable performance targets. It could be changes related to compensation. You're not getting expected bonuses or raises. There could be changes related to working conditions, like you've got changing work hours or your regular shifts are changing. And a big bucket related to supervisor communication, which we've been talking about a lot. So whether someone's not discussing career trajectory, kind of like that story, Jason, you were talking about, maybe the employee's being unfairly evaluated, they're getting excessively harsh feedback, maybe somebody's ghosting them, canceling meetings, maybe you're not getting credit for your own work, someone else is getting it. So those were identified in that Harvard Business Review article, sort of things to look out for if you are being quietly fired. Kim, what is your reaction when you hear those kind of buckets and signs?
I feel like rage applying on your behalf if this is happening to you. So the first thing I would say is, if you feel like these things are happening, first of all, locate the exit nearest you. Like, figure out, is there another job you could get? And then talk very bluntly to your manager about what's going on. I will say that some version of this happened to me, although at least he said he wasn't he was shocked when I quit. But I had a manager who changed, not really my responsibilities, but he wanted to change my title because another one of my colleagues was jealous of me. It seemed ridiculous. And he was really being an absentee manager to this other person because he didn't want to tell this other person that he couldn't have that job. But I was paying the price for his absentee management of this other person. And I did rage quit. But I didn't have such a happy experience as Brandy. I mean, I did get another job, but then the other job was like, whoa, this was out of the frying pan and into the fire. And so I quit that job too. And you know what? It all worked out. Like, in the end, if you can swing it financially, don't forget to quit is excellent career advice. So make sure you look for the exit nearest you. Make sure you know what your exit options are and know what your BATNA, your best alternative to negotiated agreement, is. And then go challenge your boss directly and say, look, this change in my responsibilities is BS, or not giving me expected bonuses is BS, or my working conditions are, it's like, I don't know what the employment term of, but it's like constructive eviction. When your landlord makes so much noise in your apartment or turns off the heat or something, so you're forced to, that's called constructive eviction. This is like constructive firing. It is your boss's job to give you good feedback and enough of it, and not nitpicking, not like constantly overly criticizing you. But you've got to have the conversation, and it's a good idea to know what your options are. If you feel like you're being sort of quietly fired, make sure you have a good option. And sometimes you may learn when you go confront your boss that the exact opposite. They'll be horrified. I was speaking with one person who led a law firm, and a woman at the law firm who he was convinced was going to be like one of the great partners at the law firm quit. And he went to her, he said, why? You were on track to make partner. Why are you leaving? And she looked at him in great surprise and she said, I had no idea I was on track to make partner. Nobody ever told me. And so he realized he was never going to make that mistake again. He was going to have more explicit conversations with people.
Jason, where do you sit on kind of legal remedies in terms of documenting? In this Harvard Business Review, they talk about documenting the good, documenting the bad, if there's any mistreatment, thinking about seeking legal help, potentially legal action. Do you have any recommendations on that front?
I want to say something positive here. The reason why the law, like employment law, exists is because employers do illegal stuff all the time. Like documenting the illegal stuff that your employer is doing is one of the best ways to give you a case. But cases take years to get litigated, and you may or may not get a result. Like the juice may never be worth the squeeze. So I think like legal remedies are not necessarily your best option. I think on TV, they all talk about all the time that lawsuit and it gets settled and all this other stuff. And it makes it seem like, oh, it's just a thing that happens quickly and gets resolved. I have direct experience companies doing illegal, friends who went through situations where other companies were doing obviously illegal things. And they talked to an employment attorney, and the employment attorney was like, yeah, we can take action, but it's going to take, set your watch, because it's going to be 3 years before like anything happens with this. So I think Kim's advice is really good. Like having that conversation to make sure you're actually in the situation that you think you're in is probably the most useful thing you can do. And then remembering that if it is actually the case that your manager is like, yes, I'm trying to kind of force you out, like they may actually be willing to help you. It may not be that they're unwilling to help you. They may be shy, nervous, feel unskilled in having a conversation about how to manage you out or something like that. So there may be, even if it turns out that they are actually trying to push you out, they may be willing to do more work to help you if you confront them about it. So there's still a possibility that there's like a benefit to having that direct conversation. But I think, Brandy, your example of rage applying is like a really good thing to do. I don't think you need to quit either. Like if you can put yourself into a Zen state of mind where you're like, I'm 1 foot out the door and I'm using the time that they're mistreating me to apply for other jobs to like give myself some cover. Like you don't owe this. An organization that treats you in the way that we were describing here deserves no loyalty from you. So take whatever time you need, apply for other jobs, do whatever you can do to make your landing on the way out as soft as possible. But a boss who's willing to do this is not someone who you can work with long term. This is going to manifest in some other way, even if you were to work it out this time, unless the boss is like literally clueless and had no idea that they were doing this and makes an earnest commitment to changing their behavior so that you know where you stand going forward and demonstrates that behavior. That's the only situation in which I think this is salvageable. Otherwise, you're looking for another team or another company someplace else.
I will say one good thing about documenting is that sometimes this sort of quiet firing can be a form of gaslighting you. And sometimes when you document, even if you don't wind up suing, it can dispel the gaslighting. Because as you start to write down what's happening, you're like, the problem is not me, the problem is them. So That's one. And it preserves your option for if you decide later to take legal action, or if you decide to sort of write up what happened to help other people. I was talking to Susan Rigetti, who was Susan Fowler when she wrote her memo about what was happening to her at Uber. And she kept documenting things, and she kept actually going to HR, even though HR was obviously not going to solve her problems, and then documenting what HR said. And her memo would not have been as good. Her blog post about her mistreatment at Uber would not have been nearly as good. That was definitely a case of, I wouldn't call that quiet firing. They were that was loud, bad behavior. And I don't think they understood that it would drive her away. I don't know what to call what happened at Uber, but bullshit, I think, is the technical term for it.
Yeah. And I think that's such a good point. Like it was really helpful for my acquaintance who was going through this to like talk to someone about what was happening to them and to have it validated that this was in fact bullshit. Like what they were going through was wrong. And they would not have been able, the lawyer had the conversation with them because they had documentation. They actually said, like, you have a case, but you have to be willing to do what it takes in order to see this case through. And the question is like, are you willing to do that? I think that's an indictment of our justice system, not necessarily an indictment of documentation. So I just wanted to clarify, like the documentation is still valuable to preserve your options. And I think your point about just validating your own experience, like so that you know that you're not losing your mind, that these things actually did happen to you. I think it's so important.
At another job, something like this did happen to me, and I couldn't stay because my health was being so negatively affected that I thought I had a brain tumor, and I went to the doctor and had an MRI, and they said, no, it's stress. You need to do something. So I ended up leaving that job without having another one lined up. And then I learned that in most states, you can get unemployment if you can prove that anyone else would have done the same thing in that situation. And that's where the documentation is really helpful, because I was able to provide that documentation. I was able to provide witnesses that they could call. And that just helped me make an easier transition into being able to look for another job.
That is a really important point, because being able to collect unemployment is really important.
Just to wrap up, given what we're talking about, and given that last season we talked about the Great Resignation, we've got a Pew Research Center survey noting that low pay, lack of opportunities for advancement, people feeling disrespected at work are the top reasons why Americans quit their jobs last year. Can we feel some optimism, or is today's workplace culture feeling like a dressed up version of the Hunger Games? I just want to get a pulse check from you all, Kim, Jason, if you have any inspiring words on what you're hearing, since we just talked about some poor management and the results of it for team members.
I would say when you rage quit, slow down a little bit and look for a thought partner. There are great managers out there, and there are great companies out there. So I would encourage people to A, look for a thought partner, and B, especially once you know what your exit options are, give your current manager a chance. I mean, I'm so grateful to that person who came to me and said, when do we get to just talk to you, Kim? When do you help us think? That was what made me realize I was being more of an absentee manager and less of a thought partner for that person and for a lot of other people on the team. And that feedback really helped me course correct. So your manager may not be the horrible person that it seems like they're being. Give them a chance to do the right thing, but protect yourself.
I tend to think that there is hope. We work with organizations all the time who are recognizing some of these patterns and trying to do what they can to change them. And so from my perspective, I think someone said earlier in this episode that a lot of these things don't seem very new, actually. It seems like these things may have been happening for quite a long time. And I think that's true. We're just sort of starting to name them. And to some extent, as with everything else, like when you start to be able to name something for the first time, you notice it everywhere. And so it seems like things are getting worse, when in fact, we're just noticing what's going on. And that noticing is the first step to being able to correct it. So I think the fact that there are more open conversations about that, the fact that the legal landscape is changing, and California, for example, now has rules in place to have like salary information be publicly available. Like the landscape is changing, and I think it is bending to towards something that is better. But each of these instances is wrong. I mean, it's unjust. Like if you're in the situation that's happening to you, it is unjust. So I think Kim's advice about protecting yourself is probably the best thing that we can offer. And to remember that you probably do have colleagues at work who'd be willing to support you. So don't think that you're going through it alone. And I think Brandy's example, like, don't be afraid to reach out to somebody else and see if you might be wanted someplace else. So like before the rage quit, the rage apply seems like a good place to start.
So now it's time for our Radical Candor checklist tips you can use to start putting Radical Candor into practice.
Tip number 1, don't hire people and never talk to them again. Being a hands-off manager is different than being an absentee manager. All managers should be having regular one-on-one meetings with their direct reports and actively soliciting feedback and having very active career conversations.
Tip number 2, don't be a jerk. Qualifying really is gaslighting at its worst, junior high behavior at its best. I think that's giving it too much credit, but it really is no
high behavior is the worst of all possible behavior.
You think?
I am planning. My children are graduating from middle school, and I'm planning a giant celebration. We need the middle school.
Are you saying junior high behavior is worse than quiet firing, or are they?
I'm just saying.
I mean, it was the worst years of my life for sure.
Yeah. Anytime work feels like junior high school, it's not its best.
I like junior high. Anyhow, it's no way to build a business or a solid team. And it is going to come back to bite you. Yes, Kim, we are watching Office Space, and listeners, if you want to join us, we'll try to catch up on that. If you need to let someone go for whatever reason, please, please, please put your radically candid conversations and radical candor practices, emphasis on compassionate candor, to work. We'll put a link in the show notes.
And tip number 3, if you find yourself struggling with an absentee manager, or you're worried that you might be being quiet fired, follow Kim's advice and give your manager a chance to do the right thing. You can start by requesting a one-on-one with them and sharing the challenge that you're having, sharing a challenge you might be having at work, letting them know why you want some additional support from them. See if they're willing to step up and actually help you. But sometimes your manager just doesn't know that they're not giving you the support that they need. And it's much easier to do that soon and before you become resentful than it is to wait. And better to know if you're in a situation where you're not going to get the support you need from your boss so that you can take additional steps.
As Jerry Maguire said, help me, help you. Or that wasn't Jerry Maguire. That was the play.
The Cuba Gooding Jr. character. I mean, that was his agent, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Tip number 4, before you rage quit, don't forget to rage apply. Is there a job you've always wanted and always dreamed of, but been too afraid to reach out for whatever reason? Don't think you're qualified, political reasons, it's the competition. Put that anger into action and contact that publisher, hiring manager, CEO. You never know what might happen.
For more tips, you can go to radicalcandor.com/resources to download our learning guides for practicing radical candor. Show notes for this episode, go to radicalcandor.com/podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Hey, do you have a career topic you'd like to hear us discuss? More talk about rage applying, rage quitting, rage coffee? Go ahead, email us at podcast@radicalcandor.com. Maybe there's a movie we need to watch and critique on the show. Finally, looking for Radical Candor swag? Go to radicalcandor.com, click the shop link. Coffee mugs, pillows, wrapped canvas wall art of the 2x2, and more. Bye for now. Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter at Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.